The Chicken Asylum, an Alex Reynolds mystery. Author, Fred Hunter. Publisher, St. Martin's, Griffin, New York. Narrator, Eric Aust. Chapter 4. Peter and I overslept the next morning. We found Mother and James already eating when we came down. James was much less sullen over breakfast and ate with less determination than before. Apparently, he was beginning to trust that we wouldn't snatch the food from his mouth. Maybe it was because he knew we were sisters under the skin. Soldiers might take your food, but fellow faggots wouldn't. He was also a bit more effusive, telling us a little about his family and what meals had been like back home. "Nothing like here," he assured us, spearing a sausage with his fork. He held it up in front of his eyes and gazed at it with wonder. He talked at great length in his halting English about the lack of food in his country. I was beginning to think that Iraqis were as interested in food as the British are in the weather, although the latter couldn't claim their interest sprang from scarcity. Mother seemed to find the new openness surprising, but I hadn't yet had a chance to get her alone and tell her what had happened during the night. Along with his new measure of ease, James had developed a noticeable restlessness. While he talked, he continually kept his foot tapping, not making any noise, but causing the table to vibrate. And he shifted in his seat more often than not. The semi-confinement he'd suffered since leaving his homeland was obviously wearing on him. Peter was running late, so he hurried through breakfast and raced out the door before I reached it. I stood there like Donna Reed, complete with the confused pout. And right on cue, my faithful husband popped back in the door and gave me a peck on the cheek. Nelson and the boys arrived at 9 o'clock on the dot. They made straight for the dining room, ready to launch back into questioning poor James without as so much as a "by your leave," as Mother would say. But she caught Nelson by the arm, and just before he sat down, with the formality of a duchess in a West End comedy, she said, "Might I have a word with you, Larry, in the kitchen?" "And me too," I chimed in. "Of course." We went into the kitchen, and I closed the door. "Is there a problem?" he asked. "The problem," Mother said in a measured voice, "is that boy." "Has he given you any trouble?" "Quite the contrary. You're the ones giving me trouble. You practically worried that boy to death with your questions yesterday. You had him so frazzled that from the moment you left, he could barely keep his eyes open." "It's what he's here for," Nelson said. "I know that, and so does he." "And so do I added, sounding exactly like one of the Cratchit children. Mother continued, "But for God's sake, he's almost a child, and he's a human being who's trying to help you. I might add, I don't like this business of you grilling him like he's a bit of beef." "Why do you suggest we do?" Mother tilted her aquiline nose upward. "These aren't suggestions, Larry. They are house rules. I want you to give him breaks at regular intervals. You have to let him get up and stretch himself now and then." "We don't have him chained to the table," Nelson said without emotion. "Not physically," I said, "but Nelson, you're the authorities. He probably feels he can't move without your permission. Hell, he practically feels he can't move without our permission." Nelson eyed me for a moment in a rare spirit of concession. He said, "I don't think I'd really considered that." "Quite right, you didn't," said Mother. "And another thing, I want him to have a proper lunch." If Nelson ever displayed any emotion, he would have registered his surprise. "We fed him yesterday." "Yes, you did, exactly as if he were in a zoo and made him work straight through it at that. I intend to give him a proper lunch in here with us, away from you people." After a beat, Nelson said, "Understood." There was a long pause. "Anything else?" "Yes," I said. "Why did you tell us he was gay?" "What?" Mother exclaimed. "James told us last night," I said to her. Then I turned back to Nelson. "Well?" "I didn't think it was your concern." "Oh, right. Are you going to tell me that that's not why you wanted him here with us?" "I told you exactly why I wanted him here. I thought he'd be more comfortable." There was that maddening honesty again. That was exactly what he'd said. He just left out the most important part. You thought he'd be more comfortable with us because he's gay, right? So why didn't you tell us? A smile formed behind his eyes. You surprised me, Alex. I surprise you? Yes, I would think that you'd believe it is up to an individual to reveal his own sexual identity. The hinges that hold the top of my head on started to snap. There's nothing I like less than having my own ethics thrown up at me. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. Tell me something. Were you really concerned about his comfort, or did you think that throwing him in with a couple of gay guys would make him feel safe enough that you might get more information out of him? There was never any question of that, he replied easily. He's been more than willing to give us information. He was silent for a moment. Now, if I may. Wait, I said, stopping him as he headed for the door. One more thing. Just how much of an eye are we supposed to keep on him? What do you mean? You said you don't want him to feel like he's in prison. Exactly how free is he? As free as he can be under the circumstances. I could feel my teeth beginning to gnash. It hardly seemed possible, but sometimes Nelson could be even more opaque than others. I mean, can he come and go as he pleases? Can he go out? He shouldn't go out unaccompanied. I see, I said suspiciously. He doesn't know the area. He would get lost. You can take him out with you if you like, as long as you're careful. I don't like the sound of that, said Mother. Nelson shrugged. Just common sense. We're as certain as we can be that nobody has any idea where he is, and the chances of someone recognizing him are practically non-existent. But if you do take him out, I would like you to stay alert to anything unusual. Like what? Anything. I don't foresee any problems. But if you notice something, let me know. I folded my arms across my chest. Nelson, why do I get the feeling there's more going on here than we know about? He shrugged again. I've told you all you need to know. With that, he went through the swinging door. Mother looked at me. Not exactly a comfort, is he? The debriefing continued throughout the day, with Mother popping into the room every now and then and announcing in her best lady Bracknell, I think it's time for a break now, don't you? The agents, except for Nelson, were visibly annoyed by her interruptions, but didn't protest, which was just as well, because it saved Mother the bother of knocking their heads together. And at noon, the three of us, four if you count the dog under the table, had a quiet lunch together in the kitchen, while the agents enjoyed a silent sandwich in the dining room. Mother's plan did work. When the agents left for the day, James was far less wrung out than he had been the night before. In fact, he was so grateful to her that, like so many men before him, he started to fall under her spell. He followed her around as she tidied up the dining room, much to the consternation of Duffy, who looked as if he felt his position was being usurped, and then stayed with her in the kitchen while she prepared dinner. I was grateful for that, because it meant that when Peter got home, I was able to greet him with a very affectionate kiss. Wow, he said, leading me upstairs. What was that for? It was just nice to get to greet you without the scrutiny of our homo-in-waiting, he laughed. What? All this time I thought he was trying to figure us out. Now I'm not so sure. Maybe he was looking for pointers. Well, if he was, he didn't get very many from us. We reached the bedroom, and Peter started to change from his suit to a pair of jeans and a light green polo shirt. I love that color on him because it intensifies the color of his eyes. Did you talk to Nelson? He asked. Yeah, I replied with an ironic laugh. And he claims he didn't tell us about James because he thought it was up to James to tell us. He raised his eyebrows. You sound impressed. I am. I didn't think he had that kind of scruples. You're kidding. You think he was right not to tell us? Well, Alex, you'd usually be the first one. Wait. I cut him off with an upraised palm. I'm going to like it a lot less coming from you than I did from Nelson. Am I the only one who thinks it's different in this case? Why? he asked as he hung his suit in the closet. Well, because. Because. I don't know. It just is. I don't see it, honey. He produced a sly smile. Unless you think we should be told the sexuality of anyone we give asylum to. You make it sound like that happens once a week. Alex. I threw up my hands. All right, I give up. I guess I was just surprised by this turn of events. Now I know how Stephen Ray felt in the crying game. Peter laughed and wrapped his arm around my waist. You really are a nut. I love you. I ran my fingers through his hair, pulled his head toward me, and kissed him gently. Now, how about after dinner we take James out? Out where? I don't know. Anywhere. He feels all pent up. It'll do him good to go out and have some fun. He pulled away from me. Can we actually do that? From his tone, I got the feeling he wasn't warming to the ideal. I asked Nelson. He said it was all right. You did, huh? He replied skeptically. Yeah. His lips spread into a loving smile. You really feel sorry for him, don't you? Yeah, and a little guilty for thinking he might crawl in here and slit our throats. After giving it some thought, he shrugged. It's all right with me, but where do you want to go? I thought for a minute. Why don't we take him to Charlene's? Charlene's? Peter echoed in disbelief. You want to take an Iraqi soldier to a gay bar? Hasn't he suffered enough? He might enjoy it. I thought you were the one who was worried about giving him culture shock. I sighed. Look, he's only going to be with us for another day. Sure, the CIA will have somebody helping him, but they're not going to introduce him to the gay community wherever they end up sending him. Come on, Peter, he might not get another chance for a long time. We're the only gay people he knows in America. Alex, we're the only people he knows in America. I spread my palms. All the more reason. He folded his arm across his chest. You know, you get more and more like your mother every day. Didn't somebody say that if you want to know what a gay boy will be like in 30 years, you should look at his mother? He laughed. Well, you tell me one thing. How exactly are we going to explain him at Charlene's? Explain what? The fact that you and I have an Iraqi soldier in tow. Oh, that. Do you think anybody will care? He nodded. We're bound to run into someone we know, and they'll think it a bit peculiar. We fell silent. Then it came to me. I know! We can just say he's a foreign exchange student. Peter curled his lip. Of course. We left for the bar at about 8. Mother waved after us from the back door as if she were watching her child go off to his first prom. James had been excited when we told him our plan. He told us in his broken English that he was anxious to see the sights. Peter replied with, You'll see sights all right. And for the first time in months, I got to poke him in the ribs. But now that we were on our way, James seemed more apprehensive. Of course, that might have been my imagination. It's more likely he was experiencing some sensory overload now that he was out. He stared bug-eyed through the windows as we drove down Halstead, his head turning to follow a passing building or pedestrian, then swinging back when he could turn it no further. He was also probably bewildered, if not scared. He'd had 2 days to become familiar with our home, and now that he was outside of its safe confines, I'm sure he felt less secure. I turned on North Avenue, drove over to Wells, and hung a right. Parking wasn't terrible since it was the middle of the week and the middle of the evening, but we still had to park 4 blocks away from the bar. I hadn't been to Charlene's for a couple of years and expected it to look the same. Gay bars in Chicago have a tendency to remain unchanged until they disappear. So I was surprised when we walked through the door and found that the once black walls of the dimly lit bar had been painted dark red, and the huge neon lights that once adorned the north wall were gone. In their place were Art Deco sconces. The tables were the same, but were covered with plastic lace cloths, and atop each one was a candle burning in a glass bowl, surrounded by plastic mesh and a bud vase with a pink rose. A long, discreet fixture had been mounted overhead and sent diffused light across the fluffy clouds that had been painted across the ceiling. "Good grief!" I exclaimed quietly to Peter. "Charlene's hormone treatments must have finally kicked in." We'd managed to arrive after the happy hour mob had dissipated, and just when the late evening crowd was starting to show up, so there were plenty of people, but still enough room to maneuver. One thing that hadn't changed was the noise level. The same huge speakers were mounted in the corners of the ceiling, and Blondie was blaring out, "One way or another." Everyone was talking very loudly to be heard over it. We found 2 empty stools in the far end of the bar. Peter chose to stand, so I sat beside James, who faced outward, and watched the men dancing together with a look of absolute wonder on his face. It was several minutes before the bartender came down to us. "Alex," he said, "long time no see." "Hi," I replied vacantly. I had no idea who he was. "It's me, Ernie." "Ernie!" I exclaimed dumbfounded. "I don't believe it." "Yeah, there's been some changes around here." There certainly had been. When last we'd seen Ernie, he was sporting a crew cut and one large gold loop to his left ear, so that along with his girth, he looked like a cross between Mr. Clean and Curly. Since then, he'd added a few more pounds and let his hair, which was greasy gray, streaked with light gray, grow down to his shoulders. Both of his lobes were now pierced and held a pair of earrings of dangling metal stripes, augmented with tiny feathers. He wore a pair of slashed jeans and an ultra-light black leather vest that made him look like a stuffed sausage. He'd gone from a gay stooge to a gay biker. I waved a hand up and down him. "I like it." "Thanks. Hi, Peter." Peter reached between James and me and shook Ernie's hands. "Nice to see you again." James turned around when he realized we were talking to someone. When Ernie saw that beautiful face, his eyes practically leaped out of his head. "Hello," he said. "Who do we have here?" "He's a foreign exchange student who's staying with us for a few days," I blurted out in one breath. I could actually feel Peter's eyes rolling behind me. Ernie's eyebrows snaked toward the bridge of his nose. "Ernie, this is James," said Peter. The bartender snatched one of James's hands up into his ham-like paw and shook it. "Glad to know you." "Your first time here?" "Yes." "You got an ID?" "An ID?" James said blankly. "Oh, Christ, I hadn't thought of that," Peter said under his breath. "No, he doesn't," I said quickly. "He just got here, but it's okay. We can vouch for him. He's 21. "Yeah," Ernie replied skeptically. "Come on, Ernie," Peter said nonchalantly. He shrugged. "Oh, okay. What'll you have?" I don't know that he would have conceded so quickly had James not been quite so good-looking. I turned to James. "Do you like beer?" "Beer, yes," James replied. "Your first drink, your first time here, is on me," said Ernie. James looked Ernie up and down, then turned his puzzled eyes to me. "He means it's free," I explained. "Oh, thank you." Ernie hurried to the center of the bar and snatched a bottle of Bud from the cooler, and then came back and slapped a white napkin in front of James. He then twisted the cap off and placed the bottle on the napkin. "Sorry about the foam," he leered. "This is okay." James picked up the bottle, put it to his lips, threw back his head, and drank like a soldier. At least I guess it was like a soldier. When he put the bottle down, half of his contents were gone. He wiped his mouth with his sleeve. Ernie's eyes never left him. I'd forgotten his predilection for the barely legal. I leaned over toward him and said pointedly, "We'll have the same." "What?" "Oh, right." I looked over my shoulder at Peter. It's nice to see not everything has changed. As Ernie got our drinks, Blondie was replaced by Pat Benatar, demanding to be treated right. James swiveled around on his stool and leaned his elbows back on the bar as he turned to watching the dancing. Ernie brought 2 more beers to us, placed them in front of me, and I paid him. "I never see anything like this," James said over the music, his eyes shining like a kid in a candy store. I gestured toward the throng gyrating through a swirl of colored lights. "Well, this is America. I do not think I could do this." "Why not? It's perfectly all right. There's nothing wrong with 2 men dancing together." He stared at me with puzzlement. "No, I mean, I do not know how." Over the din, I heard Peter snort into his beer bottle. I blushed. "Oh, of course. Sorry." We didn't say anything for a couple of minutes. James was too awestruck to speak, and Peter and I were too old to try to hold a conversation over bone-rattling music, despite the decibel level. The lights and the movement, I noticed that James had drawn the attention of a new arrival who had stopped about halfway across the room. He was tall and slim, and his hair was Village of the Damned blonde. He was dressed in a nondescript way and seemed a bit unsure of himself. He came over to us and carefully wedged himself in between James and the man sitting on his other side. He ordered a beer, and after being served, spent some time alternatingly stealing glances at James and looking down at his drink, trying to work up the nerve to say something. James remained perfectly oblivious to the attention. Finally, the young man cleared his throat, straightened his spine, and looked exactly as if he were about to climb Mount Everest. Said, "Hi." It was a second before James realized the guy was speaking to him. In fact, the guy had to repeat himself first. James reluctantly drew his eyes from the dance floor. "Hi." The young man smiled. "This your first time here?" "Yes." "I'm Bob." He offered his hand. James shook it. "I am James." "Hello, James." There was a long pause, during which my heart went out to Bob. James stared at him in that direct way of his that seemed to be waiting for the next question. Then he came. "You're not from around here, are you?" Peter placed a cautionary hand on my arm. After 8 years of marriage, he can read my mind. I had been about to blurt out our cover story again. To my surprise, James answered, "I am a student." Bob blinked. "Oh, you mean a foreign exchange student?" "Yes." They fell silent. With his limited English, James wasn't much help in keeping a conversation going, and Bob appeared to be trying to think of how to proceed. Finally, he said, "Do you want to dance?" James looked at the dance floor, and his face practically collapsed with distress. "I not know how." With unbelievably good timing, the music shifted from Benatar back to Blondie, this time the slow and sensual, In the Flesh. The crowd fell into each other's arms. "Come on," said Bob, taking James's hand. "You don't have to know anything to do this." "It's good," James said to me. "It's all right," I replied. James almost catapulted off his stool, and Bob led him onto the dance floor. They stood on the periphery of the other couples, and James forced his partner uncertainly. Bob finally took James's arms and wrapped them around his own waist, then put his arms around James's neck. If James had been unsure of what to do at first, once he was in close proximity to another man, he sure as hell found out fast. He plastered himself against Bob like a full-body version of the alien facehugger. Bob didn't exactly look like he minded. If anything, he looked delighted. "That's our boy," I said to Peter in my best imitation of June Cleaver. Peter wasn't amused. He took a long drink, his eyes never leaving our little charge. "What's the matter?" He pursed his lips. "You remember what happened to some concentration camp survivors when they ate too quickly after being freed?" I glanced over at James. "He'll be all right." "I hope so." Blondie soon gave way to Diana Ross and Upside Down. James continued to cling to Bob, unmoved by the change in tempo. Bob finally took hold of his arms and physically pushed him back a bit, then leaned close to his ear and said something. James looked at the other dancers and shook his head. The two of them came back to their stools. "Thank you," James said warmly. "Thank you so much." "No, thank you," Bob said with a wide grin. He raised his beer bottle to James and took a long drink. James turned to us, his face fairly beaming. "This is, I don't know how to say, wonderful," I said. "Mm-hmm. I think you mean this is wonderful." "Yes," he said uncertainly. "It makes me very happy." We listened to the music and watched the dancers. Bob hovered anxiously on the side of our threesome, trying to will it into a quartet. He made occasional forays into conversation with James, something that was difficult even under less noisy circumstances, and seemed undaunted by the monosyllabic answers. I had to give Bob credit. It's hard to hold up both ends of a conversation. After a while, James leaned over to me and said, "You know where his toilet?" "Yeah," I pointed toward the back of the room. "You see that doorway at the end of the hall? That's where the bathrooms are." "Thank you." He made his way past the end of the dance floor and threaded through the close tables where people sat in huddled conversation, then went through the doorway. "You think one of us should go with him?" asked Peter. "He made it clear to me his first night here that he knows how to do it himself." He sighed heavily. "You know what I mean." "He'll be all right." "Well, hello, boys," a familiar voice announced behind us. We turned to find Stevie Sullivan, one of our oldest friends. Actually, one of Peter's oldest friends, who I'd inherited through marriage. "Hi, Stevie," I said, echoed by my husband. "I'm surprised to see you here." "Not half as surprised as I am to see me here. La-di-da." As the saying goes, he sounded uncharacteristically dejected. "Is something wrong?" "Ernie, sweetie, beer." He called down the bar. He turned to me as he took a seat on James's stool. "I'm here to drown my sorrows." "What's wrong?" Over his shoulder, I saw Bob slide off his stool and head in the direction of the bathroom. Stevie sighed dramatically. "I have been dumped again." "Of course." "I'm sorry. Was this the redhead?" I can't remember his name. "The redhead?" he replied, squinting at me. "Oh, you mean Jerry." "Oh, dear God, no. I haven't been with him for 2 years. He decided to go into this seminary." Ernie put the beer in front of him, and he snatched it up. "With his superior oral skills, Jerry will be a welcome presence in the Archdiocese of Chicago." "Cheers." He took a healthy drink. "Who was this, then?" Peter asked. "My most recent debacle, Willie. He was a sweet young man, about the size and shape of the Pillsbury Doughboy. Not much to look at, but guaranteed to rise. No, I shouldn't be bitter, but we were planning to move in together. I mean, I thought he was finally it. We were actually shopping for furniture." "What happened?" Stevie frowned. "He fell in love with a cashier at IKEA." "I'm sorry," I said, fighting not to laugh. Peter took a bit of my arm in between his thumb and forefinger and twisted it to help me. "I guess he wanted the discount more than he wanted me, cheap bastard." He paused for another gulp of beer. "So, here I sit. The only meaningful relationship I'm having at the moment is with reruns of Magnum P.I. I mean, where are all the devoted husbands I keep hearing about?" He glanced at Peter, then back at me. "Oh, I forgot. You took him." "There's a lot of other guys out there," I said, though it couldn't help sounding trite. Anything said in response to that would have. "Not for the plucking, especially when you got more than one." "What?" "I saw that beautiful piece of chicken that was with you." "Chicken?" I said, my voice rising. He flapped his wrist at me. "Oh, Alex, don't go all Mama Rose on me. Who is he anyway?" "Just a friend. A student. He's only in town for a couple of days." "Just my luck. All the good ones are either married or straight." He took another drink. "Or leaving. If you excuse me, I'm going to go mingle. I'm sure Mr. Wright is just waiting for me in this sweaty mess of alcoholics." Peter and I laughed, not without concern, as Stevie slid off his stool and made his way into the crowd. "Poor Stevie," I said when he was out of earshot. "He doesn't have a lot of luck in love, does he?" said Peter ruefully. "He's not going to get lucky here," Peter laughed. "Yes, he is." "You know what I mean," I said. I took a drink. "So Stevie's alone again, and we're giving Asylum to chickens. Do you ever wonder what happened to us?" "No, I always knew we'd end up in some kind of asylum." We laughed and then stood finishing our beers in companionable silence through the next couple of songs. Then Peter glanced over toward the doorway. "Hasn't he been gone a long time?" "Hmm? Oh, you mean James?" "I guess. Maybe you should go check on him." "In the bathroom," I said after a beat. "Yeah." "Here?" "Yeah. I'm not going back there to see what he's doing." I jerked my thumb at Bob's empty stool. "Dennis the Menace here followed him in," Peter shrugged. "Just another reason to make sure he's all right." "Why don't you go?" The corner of his mouth crooked into a wicked smile. "Coming here was your idea. I thought we'd just sit and have a couple of drinks. I didn't think he'd do things like dance and go to the bathroom." Peter shook his head and sighed with exasperation. All right, I'm going," I said, staring across the floor. Before I reached the doorway, I was relieved to see Bob emerging. He looked decidedly dissatisfied. I thought perhaps he'd tried to hit on James and found the language barrier unscalable, and smiled inwardly at the puzzled expression that would have been on James's face when confronted with terms that couldn't possibly have been in a course in English as a second language. Even in the most progressive Iraqi schools, at least Bob looked physically intact, which meant he hadn't gotten heavy-handed about it. I've had passes made at me in bars, before I was married, of course, that consisted of an injudicious hand applied to my crotch. I had a feeling that that wouldn't be too wise an approach to use on someone trained in Mortal Kombat. I reached the doorway and stopped in my tracks. At the end of the short hall, behind the twin doors for the men's and ladies' rooms, was a payphone, and James was on it. He had the index finger of his free hand stuck in his ear in an effort to hear whoever he was talking to, and his back was turned to the doorway as he didn't see me. Even at that distance and with the noise, I could hear him babbling in his own language into the receiver. I was so startled that for a moment I froze in place. Then I quickly turned and went back to Peter. "What's wrong?" he asked when he saw the look on my face. "Nothing." "Come on, Alex, what is it? Did you walk in on something?" I took a drink. "You could say that." I was silent as we drove home, but James didn't notice. After the secretive phone call, he'd danced a couple more times with Bob. Apparently, the language barrier doesn't matter much when you're virtually being rolfed on the dance floor. I swear James held him so tight I fully expected his face to be printed on Bob's shirt when they parted, like the Shroud of Turin. When he was back with us, he continued to behave like the perfect little Iraqi homo who didn't know nothing about nothing, sitting on his stool and lapping up atmosphere and beer in equal measure. On the way home, he bubbled with excitement, though he was hard-pressed to express it, since he had learned. "This is wonderful." He repeated that over and over again, with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The way his face shone was completely at odds with the furtive way he'd looked when making his surreptitious phone call. Mother greeted us with a broad smile when we got home and asked James if he'd enjoyed himself. Predictably, he answered, "Yes, this is wonderful." "I'm so glad," she replied, giving him a hug, from which he didn't recoil. "I'm going to bed." I was too preoccupied to realize how abrupt this sounded. "What?" said Mother. "I'm going to bed." "Are you all right?" Peter asked. "Yeah, I'm just tired." Without further discussion, I left them standing in the kitchen, looking fittingly surprised. I heard James say, "Something is wrong." "Not at all," Mother replied, her tone doubtful. Ordinarily, I would have told my loved ones straight out. what was bothering me. But I couldn't do that in front of James, and having become sympathetic toward him, I was so disturbed by this sudden new wrinkle that I didn't much like bouncing it off of Mother and Peter until I could come up with some sort of plausible explanation on my own. I undressed and got into bed, but of course couldn't sleep. Try as I might, I couldn't think of a single legitimate reason James would have for phoning somebody. If he needed to get in touch with Nelson or Dunning, he could have easily and more logically done that from our house. He didn't have to do it furtively at the bar. About an hour after I went to bed, Peter came into the room. I pretended to be asleep, still not feeling like talking, and listened as he removed his clothes and climbed in beside me. I was lying on my side with my back to him, but I could feel him looking at me. Finally, he spoke my name, softly, to see if I was awake, and then, after a brief wait, leaned over and kissed me lightly on the cheek. He then lay back and went to sleep. I tossed and turned for hours, trying to explain away what I'd seen, but continually came up against a blank wall. When I looked at the clock and found it was almost 2, I gave up. I got out of bed as quietly as I could, slipped into my powder blue terry cloth robe, and went downstairs to make some tea. I thought maybe that would relax me. I filled the kettle with water, switched on one of the front burners on the stove, and placed the kettle on it. When I turned to sit down, I cried out. Peter was standing in the doorway, his hair attractively tousled, and his eyelids at half-mast. He was wearing his dark green silk robe. "Jesus!" I exclaimed quietly. "I didn't hear you. What's going on?" I couldn't sleep. "I know," he said, coming into the room. "I heard you get up. When are you going to tell me what's wrong? What happened when you went to check on James? Did he make a pass at you or something?" "Oh, I wish," I said as I dropped into a chair at the kitchen table. This fully opened his eyes. "What?" "I mean, I wish it was as simple as that." "Well, what happened?" I sighed. When I went back to the hallway, I found him on the phone. Peter sat down across from me. "What?" "Exactly. I can't think of any good reason he would have been making a call." "Did he see you?" "No, his back was to me." "So he doesn't know you saw him?" "Right." He sat back in his chair, looking as flummoxed as I felt, only it looked better on him. I said, "I mean, I know I was a little scared about having him here at first, but over the past couple of days, I've started to feel sorry for him. Now I don't know what to think." "About what?" said Mother, who'd silently appeared at the door. I started so suddenly I slammed my knee into the leg of the table. "Jesus Christ!" I exclaimed, cradling my knee with my hands. "Shh! You'll wake James," she said as she came over to me. "If you two don't want me to cry out, then you should stop creeping up on me like that. What are you doing up?" She curled her lips at me and replied nasally, "I'm British, darling." I could feel tea being made. There was a beat, then she added, "I could hear you moving about down here. I wanted to know what was up with you." I told her when I finished. She said, "My, that certainly is a puzzle." The kettle had begun to boil. She lifted it off the stove and switched off the burner. "I wonder what it means." "He's not supposed to know anyone in America, is he?" said Peter. "I can't remember if Nelson actually said that, or if we just assumed it because they wanted James to stay with us." I said, "Then who was he calling?" I thought for a moment and finally had an idea. Maybe he was calling someone in Iraq? Or from a payphone in a gay bar? Well, why would he do that? "Obviously," said Mother as she poured the hot water into her favorite ceramic teapot, "because he didn't want anyone to know he was doing it." "It doesn't make any sense," I said. "He wouldn't want anyone in Iraq to know where he is, would he?" "He could have been calling his family there," Peter offered. "I suppose, but wanting to talk to his family, that would be perfectly natural. Why hide it? Why not just ask if he could do it from here?" "Oh, I can understand that," said Mother. "It's quite possible Nelson told him he didn't want him to do it, lest someone's traced his whereabouts." She dropped a couple of tea bags into the pot and set it on a trivet in the center of the table, then set out mugs for each of us. "The question is, what do we do about it?" I asked. "Well, that's easy. We have to tell Larry," said Mother. "Tell Nelson?" "I don't know. I'd feel like I was tattling." "No, darling," she said as she took her place at the table. "Telling him that James broke a window would be tattling. Telling him that James may be planning to overthrow of the American government would be prudent. Oh, come on." "Look, honey," said Peter, sitting up as straight as his tired body would allow. "We're always getting into scrapes because we don't tell Nelson when something happens. For once, why don't we do the sensible thing and let him know and see what happens? At least he'd had the good grace not to point out that I was the one always getting us into scrapes." "But it could just be something innocent," I said at last. "He's watched a lot of TV. Maybe he was calling one of those 900 numbers." "There's one way to find out," said Mother as she reached for the pot. "Ask James who he was calling." She started to tilt the spout toward my mug, but I covered it with my palm. "No thanks, I don't want any." "What?" "It'll keep me awake, and I don't need any help doing that." Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.